The Y Curve with Phil Dobby and Roger Hearing.
Accusations of anti-Semitism and genocide hurled on UK streets.
An escalating conflict in the Middle East between people distinguished by what? Religion or race?
What is it that causes us to define race and discriminate against other humans on what we think we know about their genetic background?
So what is racism? Where does it come from?
And what does it mean in a world where borders signify less and less, and your friends, neighbours and colleagues could have family origins in any one of 100 different countries?
Are we moving into a post-racial world?
The Y Curve.
So I've got a confession at the beginning.
Right.
I have no black friends.
Right. Okay.
And I think I've got one or two Jewish friends, but they're not overtly, practicing Jewish people.
Yes, you're digging a big hole here.
Well, no, I'm just telling it like it is. I mean, okay. I don't think. I mean, it's not that I, actively discourage forming friendship. Well, but I just don't come across many black people in my life.
You do live in Farnham in Surrey.
Let's
be
in the
whitest
part of the world, exactly.
Yeah.
And there's the question as to why have we chosen to live here? I mean, the argument would be because there's lots of horses, and my wife likes riding horses, which in itself is a very white thing to do.
Well, it is, and we should, as I say, right up front. Today we are two white people, and we're being joined by a third shortly, talking about racism, and that is in some way not wholly desirable.
Well, no, exactly, because it would be very easy for people to say, well, what would you know about racism? Because you never experienced it.
No, absolutely.
And you do experience hate or dislike, that you might rub some people up the wrong way by nature of who you are or something that you say, because it's not. Racism is founded on hate, isn't it? There's that word hate, which is not always related to race, because we all like to be part of a group.
Yeah, it's fear, I think, as well. It's this idea that fear and hate obviously mixed up very closely together. But the idea that someone is different and you dislike difference. Yeah. But why does difference matter? Well, it matters if you feel threatened, I suppose.
But I think it's a bit more than that as well, isn't it? Because you think back at school. So at school, were you with the cool kids, or were you with you were in the nerdy brigade?
Well, barely that. Yeah.
Even the nerdy brigade had cast you aside. Yeah. So I mean, and the cool kids like to have a go at the nerds as much as possible.
Yes.
So I just met up with a group of friends. I mean, it wasn't quite as severe as that, because it was university age where we were. But there was definitely a cool group and a nerdy group.
And people always sort themselves.
And I was in the nerdy group, but now we're all just the same, And they, in fact, one of the guys from the cool group said, "Oh, do you want to join the cool kids now?" And I'm going, "Well, not really, because the cool kids now are just old men like me. You're not cool. You're not cool anymore."
So but I suppose people say, "Well, there's a world of difference between that and not being able to live in a particular part of the world."
Absolutely.
Or go into a restaurant or whatever because of the colour of your skin.
But this fundamental thing is that we want to differentiate ourselves somehow. We want to be part of a group, and we distrust people. I was just giving that as an example because it's such a mild example. But is it the same fundamental difference that for whatever reason we want to form a group, be part of that group, and believe that everybody else who's not in that group is not as good as we are?
Well, I think that's why, for example, the diversity in the boardrooms of the UK, for example, is far, far less than it should be, because people like themselves. There's always that feeling, bring together people.
Rich men on boards want more rich men on boards.
Essentially, yes. And men, there's another area of lack of diversity, but also people who look like us, eat the same food, speak the same language, It's conscious or subconscious, it exists.
Yeah. And it's very sad, isn't it? Much as we don't want it to happen, it just keeps on happening. And in various parts of the world, it's happening to such an extreme degree that people are prepared to kill each other or massacre.
Purely on the basis that they have a different religion or a different supposed ethnic makeup. Well, let's investigate this, where it comes from, what it means, with someone who studied racism on a global context. Alastair Bonnett is Professor of Social Geography at Newcastle University. He wrote the book Multiracism, Rethinking Racism in a Global Context.
So, Alastair, we tend to think, don't we, that racism is a white thing. And I wonder whether, in fact, that's because that's been the version that's been around for a long time. So there was a German scientist, Johann Blumenbach, who wrote the book on the natural variety of mankind back in 1776. And he said there's 5 groups. There's Caucasian, Mongolian, Malayan, Ethiopian, and American. Presumably he meant Native American. And he ranked them. No surprisingly, he put Caucasian at the top. Maybe that's because that's what he was. But I mean, is that how? I mean, that Is that how this all started? Just this sense of white superiority?
An attempt almost scientifically, in highly inverted commas, to say that there are these different races.
It seems to be the case that in that period when Blumenbach was writing, and there were plenty others like him saying similar things, the idea of this sort of racial hierarchy got going, and very much with the Europeans at the top. So it's no coincidence that was the time in which the European empires were expanding furthest, and people really look forward to white people anyway, to a kind of European-dominated world. But it was never that simple. And racism is something that is far more complicated. And academics always say this.
Perhaps we should define what we mean by racism to start with in the classic sense. Is it simply an understanding or a concept that there are different races and an attempt to use that? Is that really what racism is?
Well, use it for subjugation. I mean, one definition of racism is it's an ideology and it's a practice of ethnic and racial subjugation. So it's got to have that element. But, and there is, a big caveat here for me, because racism is being called out in all sorts of ways across the world now, and it isn't really for me or anybody else to come up with the final and definitive judgment on what racism is. I mean, let's face it, like the Yazidis who are being killed by ISIS in Syria, in Iraq, many of their leaders were saying we are fleeing out of fear of racism. And this is a word, racism, which is being taken up by all sorts of groups across the world in the 21st century. And really, it's up to us to listen to that. That's why I wrote this book, Multiracism, because I wanted to listen to this increasingly diverse, and really fast-moving debate. So it's fine. Yes, we need a definition of racism, but we also need to be prepared to listen to people from outside of the little Western community talking about their experiences.
Because we should obviously face up to the fact that we are three white men talking about this.
Yeah, exactly. So what do we know, apart from we have supposedly the sense of superiority that we've had for hundreds of years? But I mean, is there, which I don't have, by the way, and I wonder whether that has diminished somewhat since 1776, and Blumenbach wrote that book, and we've all become a little bit more realistic about our place in the world.
I think less likely, actually, if you look at the history of the 19th century. But anyway,
yeah, but I mean more recently. Yeah. But I mean, but it seems that it is an issue around the world, as we're saying. It's not, and yet there is this belief, isn't there, that it's worse. So, for example, the epicenter of racism is America. It might be elsewhere.
Allegedly.
Well, it's racist for me to say that, obviously. But I mean, there'll be other places in the world where there is racism, but maybe not to the same extent.
Well, that depends who you're listening to. I mean, if you are in America or you're in Britain and you're getting lots of news and commentary about America, yeah, it looks like America is the center of the planet. But, if you're in East Asia, or if you're in South Asia, or say, for example, you're a black African coming up to North Africa, then you will see the world differently, and you'll see the severity of racism differently. And America might look like the promised land compared to the kind of experiences that you have. But anyway, I want to come back to this thing about whiteness, because actually, that's something I used to write about, and I'm still interested in it. And obviously, some of the key moments of racism have taken place in Europe in the 20th century. The Holocaust, for example, it didn't help the Jewish people that they were white. And a lot of the racism that Europe has seen over the centuries has been between ethnic groups. And that's one of the things that I want to bring out in this book, the multiracism, that racism is not just black and white, and that the white category I mean, it's full of all sorts of divisions. There's all sorts of ways people find to hate each other. I mean, to be honest, I remember when I was
often not at all related to race. So, Brexit versus Remain, woke versus anti-woke, rich versus poor. I was abused the other day on Twitter for being a boomer because I'd, deprived somebody of the ability for them to buy their own house, even though I'm.
But I mean, you can stand into any kind of disagreement. But just going back to what you were saying about, for example, the Yazidis, Alastair, in Iraq, and I bumped into them a few times, worked in that neck of the woods. The Yazidis, ethnically, if one can use that term, are not actually different, really, from any of the people they're living with. It's a religious difference, at least on the surface.
Yes.
And I suppose you could argue that in a way, is with anti-Semitism, because actually most Jews, in the way they look, in the culture they operate in, the language they speak, everything, they are assimilated. There is no obvious, clear difference.
But they're different, isn't it? It's all just they are a bit different to us, and that's the mistrust that comes from that, because we like to be part of a group.
No, I hear that, and one of the things I'm interested in is this way that what I normally called ethnic groups are calling out their experience of racism. It may be that they look similar, but people will pick up on all sorts of things to, fix difference and to say, no, you're not the same as us. It may be something like language. It may be religion. These are not unimportant aspects. They may not be necessarily written on the body, but it's amazing how people then go on to say, I think I know what they look like. I know what a Jewish person looks like. I mean, obviously, that may seem, a stupid sentence, but sentence has made sense to an awful lot of people over very many centuries. So the kind of like sense of difference being not in the body, but, being seen and being manufactured. That's something that I think we have to pay attention to that. Otherwise, we don't get to recognize the racisms which are unfolding around the world. All sorts of Muslim groups, for example, like the Rohingya in Myanmar, and of course the Uyghur in China. I mean, they can kind of be picked out physically in terms of the Chinese context. But it's really their culture that is the kind of problem, as it were, for the Chinese authorities. Anyway, sorry, I'm running across.
No. Well, what you're saying is that it is all over the world, and it has been for a while. But is it becoming more pronounced now? And why is that? Is it because we just hear about it more now, or is it because there's more of a merging of populations because we're seeing more migration? Why are we seeing it all over the world in such a more pronounced fashion?
I mean, it would be good if we heard, more about it, to be honest, because you said, we're hearing more about it. I mean, I'd love to hear more about it in the context of Africa and the different, enmities and conflicts that are going on in Africa or Asia. But actually, our focus when it comes to racism is so focused on America and then kind of us. Then those sorts of issues are often really right at the bottom of the news, even if they are in the news at all. But there is something going on, definitely, about big states wanting to have a firmer grip. And you see this in China. I mean, it's not just over the past few years. It's been, since the revolutions, really. But also in India, where we have Narendra Modi really wanting to sort of like create a more, not necessarily homogenous, but an India that's marching in one direction. And that's very much a kind of Hindu vision of India. And that's a big story. I mean, India's democracy and India's plurality has been such an important achievement in the 20th century. And unfortunately, we are seeing some rollback on that. And coming back to that point about people calling out racism, there's about 200 million Muslims in India. And increasingly, the word racism is being used by Muslim activists in India, just because the kind of level of violence that is meted out to them.
Do you think that's in a way the best way to deal with this? Because if you call everything racism, any kind of difference or dislike between groups, doesn't that devalue the term and make it harder to get a sense of what on earth's going on?
Yeah, that's right. I mean, that is an argument which is often made, and it's not a bad argument. So that's why it's so important that when I talk about racism, what I'm actually doing is just listening, or trying to listen to what terminology people are actually using on the ground. However, and this is a big point, people have other languages. Like in India, they talk about communalism. So it's an Indian term that describes kind of religious violence, conflict, communalism. So that's a useful word. They also talk about casteism, which is discrimination between the different castes, which can be very violent in India. So these are all different vocabularies. Oh, I've got another one. I remember I did some field work once in Peru talking to African heritage Peruvian people. And they weren't so interested in the concept of racism. Them and other Peruvians had this other idea, which they called Choloism, which was news to me. It turns out the Cholo is a kind of like urban mixed heritage person in Peru. They're kind of people who live in the kind of squatter camps all around Lima. So Cholo and Choloism, discrimination against Cholos. This is new vocabulary, new words. I wasn't familiar with them, but it reinforces that point about it's just important to listen. And actually, we've got a lot to learn. People assume we know everything about racism. That we really don't.
But does it all boil down to the same thing? And as I touched on it earlier about us all, we all want to be part of a group because we trust people who are in that group, and normally they are people who are like us. And it's just a question of how far you extend that. So if you start to get a state that starts to do that, then that becomes a little bit of a worry, doesn't it? Because that's what Nazi Germany was all about. Yeah. The more, but clearly a lot of states do want to sort of remove impurities to a greater or lesser extent because it doesn't fit with the group. And, and whatever that group is, whether it's built on race or religion, or any of those other factors that you've just described, it's this mistrust of people who are not in the group or not like us because they don't have the same aims that we have. And I don't know how you break out that. That seems to be the inherent problem, isn't it?
Yeah. The thing is, there has been a lot of difference and people living together and kind of rubbing along over the centuries. And to some extent, we've lost a lot of that. It can seem, if we look out of the window in London or Berlin or New York, that the world is just getting more and more cosmopolitan and diverse. But actually, if you take the longer view, and also if you look out of the window in other cities around the world, actually, the world is not getting more diverse. I mean, Turkey used to be a very diverse country, ethnically, religiously, and so on. It's still kind of diverse. It's got different Muslim groups, but it's a Muslim, 99% Muslim majority country now. It didn't used to be, and that's true of a lot of the Middle East, actually. It used to be a lot more diverse, and it seems to be to do with the state. The state comes along and says, we've got this vision, and it's kind of one size that's going to be available for everybody. We don't have much latitude because the diversity is seen as threatening. And that's what's going on in China. It's what's gone on in Turkey. It's what's gone on in a lot of the Middle East. It's what's going on in India. So it's interesting because we in the West are so comfortable with the idea that everything's more and more diverse and we're all so cosmopolitan and how great everything is. But that is just our little world we live in.
Yeah. But why does the state step in? What happens there? So, for example, Damascus was apparently, at one stage, I don't know if you've ever been there, Roger.
Yeah, many times. I mean, historically, but then putting so far back you get, it's one of the oldest cities on earth.
And was, quite a cosmopolitan city until we started to see a regime that totally destroyed that.
Well, not complete. I mean, one odd thing, in Syria, you have a situation where a very small minority religious / ethnic group is actually in charge, which is even more peculiar.
Yeah. So how do we get this situation where we have all of this diversity which is getting challenged by the state? What happens to create that situation?
Yes, there seems to be some momentum, and I guess it's true. It's different. I mean, Hitler very, very famously talked about no one talking about the Armenians anymore. I mean, he really did look to what happened in Turkey in terms of the
This is the Armenian genocide in 1915.
Yes, in Turkey. And from his point of view, it successfully occurred. And that gave him confidence that such a thing could happen in Germany. So that was states who thought they were being modern. So in Turkey, it comes back to your Blumenbach quote, actually. The young Turks or these Turkish nationalists came along and they thought they had these great modern scientific ideas. And they kind of melded that to a already pre-existing, it has to be said, distrust of the substantial Greek and Armenian and other minorities in the country. And so you see that, take up of these modern practices and the gas chambers, in a way, were kind of a modern
it's very interesting you say that it's a modern thing, because I suppose that is one essence, that an idea that races even exist, that there is such a thing as a defined race. I mean, it was notorious that in apartheid South Africa, for example, the government tried somehow to measure who was what and what was the part of their makeup, and same thing in Germany. But is there any basis to this at all? I mean, are we different races, really?
Well, the thing is, in the 20th century, scientists, not racial scientists, but other scientists, discovered genetics. And that was a real big moment and a great breakthrough. And we've all benefited hugely from a genetic understanding of the human reproduction and evolution and so on. And genetics shows that there isn't really any kind of like correlation between the gene that controls, I don't know, melanin, how dark your skin is or how dark your hair is, that gene, and a gene, any other gene. I mean, so, and nor, commonsensically would one imagine there is some sort of like correlation or trigger between these sort of race genes, like, for example, the skin color gene, and any other. So geneticists actually, and this is something that we saw from the 1930s onwards, was some of the first anti-racists. They were really kind of outspoken in England and other countries about saying, no, race is not a very useful way of dividing the world, but we've got a better one, which is genes. And, genes exist, and you can find gene pools and different, communities that have, some are short and some are tall, that stuff exists. Of course it does, but it doesn't actually map onto these old fashioned categories of race.
And I wonder whether also there's a bit of a cycle that goes on as well. All the time I've been hearing that song, What the World Needs is a Great Big Melting Pot. I can't remember what it was, a 60s hippie song. You were probably there, Roger. I'm sure you in your sarong singing along to that. But it was, but I mean, that's what we'd like. Obviously that is an ideal, isn't it, where we do all get on. And you mentioned how cosmopolitan some cities are, and London is seen as being a very cosmopolitan city because it's got such a mix of races. But when people talk cosmopolitan, the next line that someone will always come out with, oh yes, there's so many more great places to eat now. As though we see, the only contribution that all these other cultures make is that they provide another source of food for the rich people to eat. And a lot of the people who are serving in those restaurants don't actually get out and join mainstream society beyond sort of that more subservient role. So
that's interesting, yeah.
And so no wonder people in London, who are part of those ethnic groups are saying, well, hang on, give us a chance. We don't just want to run restaurants.
Yeah, that's really interesting. I mean, I hadn't really thought about that, but it does make me think about one of the most geographically widespread visible minority groups in Britain, and that's the Chinese. And really, there aren't many villages or towns in Britain that do not have a Chinese takeaway. And it's kind of one of the many invisible minority groups in Britain, because we always tend to sort of go to the cities and imagine, London and Birmingham have all that diversity. But there is actually really quite interesting and very entrepreneurial communities that live in quite sometimes quite isolated pockets, like up here in the northeast where I live in Newcastle. Newcastle is quite diverse, but my goodness, Northumberland and County Durham, there isn't much except almost every old pit village has got its Chinese takeaway. Anyway, I just find that fascinating.
But it's interesting about the Chinese, isn't it? That in the United States, I read a report saying that racism sometimes is seen in a positive light, in that Americans see Chinese people as being smarter.
Right.
And if you, in Australia, you look at Chinese kids in school, they are conscientious. You know, there's this driving force amongst the Chinese community.
Are they? I mean, isn't that really in itself, simply because it happens to be mildly beneficial, still a racial stereotyping of a vast number of people who have all kinds of different outlooks, and the risk of doing anything like that. I mean, many people in Germany in the 1920s and 30s thought the Jews were very good at handling money. It's only a very, very thin bit between something positive and something negative.
And then saying, all the Chinese are taking our jobs, let's try and stop them. Yeah, I mean, it's just another example. I've just done it there, haven't I? Just another example of how we're very quick to form opinions. But we do that in society now. I wonder if this is part of the problem. You meet somebody, irrespective of their race, you form an opinion about that person in 30 seconds. It's pretty hard to change your opinion from that first impression. And we do that to groups and society,
But we also import a lot of things if they are from a particular racial group and we meet them. We make a series of conscious or semi-conscious assumptions.
So there we are. There's your next book, Alastair. How do we fix that? I mean, because that is... it is a problem, isn't it? We are stuck with opinions about races.
Yeah.
And that's the problem.
Yeah. I mean, the state can sometimes not help. I mean, there's different levels of problem here. I mean, sometimes people just have negative opinions or they make jokes and things, and that's one level, and that can be nasty. But at the moment, we are living through a period which it's amazing, really. We've experienced genocide. We've experienced the genocide of the Yazidis. It doesn't mean they're all killed, obviously, but then the Jews weren't all killed, but there was an attempt, a concerted attempt. And in another example I've got in the book is about people in Papua, in West Papua, which is part of Indonesia now. But it's difficult to know because the numbers are difficult to find, but maybe about 500,000 Papuans have been killed since their territory was taken over by Indonesia in the 50s. And that's a lot because there's only like a couple of million Papuans. So that's a situation that could be described as genocide. And I say this to my students sometimes because they always think about slavery as an historical thing and genocide as something that happened, yonks ago. But actually, even in their young lives, not only has it happened, but there is potential for more of it to happen. And that's why we need to be a bit keener to realize that, learning from people around the world, learning that their experiences of racism can be pretty severe. Is the way forward.
I was going to say, let me inject something totally different into this, which is, Phil was mentioning cosmopolitan earlier. There is this phrase, rootless cosmopolitans. It's one of these lines that's handed to people who are terribly relaxed with any kind of culture, because there's a group of people in society who see huge benefit in having an identity, in being part of a club, in clinging to your Germanness, your Britishness, your Iraqiness, whatever it is, something that defines you, and that actually is a really good thing. And they worry about people who pick and mix from numerous cultures around the world, don't really care what background people have. There's they would say, no sense of community. And that actually can be a really valuable thing. Yeah,
I think most people, anybody who's travelled much, will meet a lot of patriotic people, whether it's in China or Argentina, not just patriotic, but people who want to be rooted and have a real sense of identity. So that has to be respected, and I certainly want a fixed identity, and it can be kind of easy, particularly somewhere like England, which has not seen like huge revolutions. We haven't been turfed out of our homeland. We've not experienced the kind of things actually a lot of people around the world have, which is huge tumult, loss of language, cultural devastation. So we kind of take it for granted that we've got this, stability, and we're still speaking English. I come back to that. I think language is really important in terms of people's identities. And
well, there's a famous thing with Nigel Farage complaining, being on a train and everyone around him speaking languages other than English, and this was a huge thing.
Yeah, well, I mean, sometimes English. I mean, you're in Newcastle, so Geordie can be difficult to understand.
Come on, none of that.
No, it can, but that pride of place in Newcastle in the northeast, it's articulated literally, through the dialect, and it means a lot to people. But it's true that languages are eroded, and then, like, if you look at China, there is the issue of language is so important. If you think about why people in Hong Kong aren't so happy with people from the rest of the mainland coming in, it turns on this issue of Cantonese versus Mandarin. Cantonese is what people speak in Hong Kong, and it's mutually unintelligible with Mandarin. And I have been in Hong Kong, and I've heard people talk about this in terms of racism. It sounds weird. Again, it comes back to this idea, well, hold on, people in Hong Kong look exactly the same as people in, the rest of China.
So it's history, isn't it? People don't want change. So it's
it's identity as well.
Well, yes, but it's that old identity is changing because it might be watered down because you've got movement of people who don't share.
No. Well, they fear they're losing it. They feel that Cantonese, which means an awful lot to them, and it's not just a language; it's a culture. Very understandably, they don't want to see it go the way of the dinosaurs. It's their identities, and so they will be active about that, and that explains quite a lot of what's been going on in Hong Kong over recent years.
And they could as likely be racist against people who come in speaking Mandarin. I mean, it goes both ways in that definition.
And obviously you've got state control there as well. So you talk to people in Hong Kong now. I mean, it's a dire situation. There's so many people leaving. So they've abandoned where perhaps generations have lived.
I just wanted to get to where racism comes from in all this. We've talked, it exists. Has it always existed? Have we always been fearful of the other? And is it fear, really, that's at the root of it?
There is this thing that historians now call proto-racism, which sounds like a bit of a fudge, but I think it's quite a very useful word. So when they talk about how the Greeks had stereotyped the Persians, for example, which was often, making fun of them and saying they're inferior, or, all these kind of stereotypes were definitely flying around the ancient world. And this is why they call it proto, not really the full thing, type of racism. It wasn't codified in any kind of science. There was no kind of like strict, boundaries about who was and what race. There was no kind of sense of like classification or strict scientific demarcation. And there wasn't really the kind of state apparatus that you might see in modern societies. But, that sounds like, it's all done and dusted. Well, it was proto-racism, and then the modern world happened, and then there was this real racism. And that is often an argument that we hear, but it's a tricky ongoing conversation. The idea that racism is modern does not mean it was all peace and love back in the medieval or ancient period. I mean, people really went at each other. And that's something a lot of ancient historians are really interested in this question these days.
But how much of that in the olden days was because it was a land grab, because you needed to take over more land because there was more food or more resources? So you need to make
the people who live there other or worse or subhuman.
Yeah, that's right. Well, you think about how the Romans thought about the Britons. They certainly regarded them as savage and uncultured, and of needing to be brought in to the empire. But
they've not changed much, actually, to be fair.
It depends where you live. But the thing is, once they'd accepted the Roman culture, then there was no idea that they were inferior. No, they could rise to any position they wanted. And that's true of, Nubians or, people in the Spanish Peninsula or wherever. Once you'd, accepted that Rome was the superior culture, then you were in.
So there was no racism per se. I mean,
You just need no racism. There was just supremacy.
There's some suggestion some Roman emperors were actually, as we would say, black.
Yes, exactly. No, you could rise to any position wherever you were, and slavery in the Roman period wasn't racial, and that is why actually they had to disfigure. Interesting anecdote. Had to disfigure their slaves. Often slaves would have like their nose slit or their ears cut off. Why was that? It's because you couldn't otherwise physically, tell a non-slave from a slave. So they had to do this to their faces to make them make it really visible and apparent.
So that doesn't sound like the answer to racism, Alastair. Is that clearly the only way to solve racism is for the what's seen as being the subservient race to just roll over and join the superior race, and everything's going to be fine from then on. The Roman approach.
The Roman approach, yeah. Well, I think in some ways, even though when we look at it internationally, which is my whole thing, racism is very much a growing and important phenomenon around the world.
Do you genuinely think there is more racism than there has been? You think it is a growing thing?
Yeah. I think there's things going on in China and India over the past 10, 15 years that haven't gone on before there. And people in those countries are using this word racism or some of them anyway, to describe it. But it's progress as well. And there has been an ability to, rub on with neighbours, and there aren't blood is not running in the streets of Surbiton or Slough or Ottawa or places which are diverse and where people have learned that they're not that different after all. Actually, sometimes that comes down to the fact that they all see themselves as Londoners, or all see themselves as British, or like in Canada, being Canadian is a big deal, and people sort of join together, and there's that kind of mosaic of peoples, but they're often all kind of proud of being Canadian.
And also perhaps the embracing of what is a global culture in terms of entertainment, sport. I mean, there's a lot of things in which everybody pretty much buys into, and that makes everyone part of the same club.
Right, so then, therefore, let's bring in the elephant in the room, which is the situation in the Middle East right now. I mean, how much of that is just inbred racism? How much of it is history? And how much of it is just basically a turf war?
Yes, multiracism, that term sort of describes the Middle East in so many ways. And certainly Jewish Israelis have got good cause to call out racism that has been directed against them, particularly because they know that there used to be Jewish populations across the Middle East, and they're no longer there now. There used to be, big Jewish population in Tunisia and other Middle Eastern countries, and they had to leave. So the Middle East is less diverse than it used to be, and part of that is to do with the expulsion of Jewish people and anti-Semitism, which is still rife across the Middle East.
And also within Israel, just saying, I work there a lot, there is a lot of anti-Arab feeling.
Exactly.
How you characterise that, whether as racist or quite logical fear, some might say, in some areas, is an interesting question.
Yeah, well, this is it. I mean, there is the anti-Semitism, but there's also anti-Arabism, and it really is. It seems to be quite rife and getting more cemented month by month, day by day, in Jewish Israeli perceptions of the world. Attitudes aren't the end of it. I mean, there is this law of return in Israel, which means that any Jewish person can go and live in Israel. And of course, for a geographer like me, I used old maps of that area just had the word Palestine written on. So the fact that there's no law of return for Palestinians is obviously a difficult thing to live with. And these two types of racism, anti-Arabism, anti-Semitism, but also the kind of anti-Palestinian, or not just anti, but a kind of, this is a problem of Israel in a way, the founding problem of not being able to recognize that there are two peoples who both have rights in this land.
But even that term you're using, peoples, means a definition of some kind, doesn't it? Who on earth is, and how would you measure whether someone is Jewish, Arab, or Palestinian?
But you're saying in the past it didn't really matter because it was just a state where they were all together. But we can't get back to that. I mean, it seems like that would be the ideal solution, wouldn't it?
Rebuild the Ottoman Empire, that's the answer.
Yes. It's been a very complicated situation in that part of the world for a very long time. I mean, yes, the Ottomans, controlled it, and then the British controlled it, but there are always lots of groups prepared to squabble with each other. But it comes back to me to one of the great things that happened after the Second World War, which was the founding of the United Nations. And in a way, the UN was all about protecting minorities and making sure this sort of conflict didn't break out again. Yeah. And so the weakness of the United Nations, the weakness of international governance, I don't know if you can even say it even exists, is a problem. And we can't just leave it to the Americans to come in on a sort of ad hoc basis to sort out all our problems.
When God knows they have their own racial problems.
But it seems like the answer is not a two-state solution. It seems like the answer is a one-state solution, but we're never going to get there because of racism and hate.
Yeah, my goodness. I mean, I'm in well beyond, my depth here to sort out.
We're going to solve the whole problem in this half-hour podcast.
Pick the bones out of that. Well, as we come towards the end of this, Alastair, let's just get a sense. I mean, you have studied racism around the world, the new racisms. Does it make you gloomy that we are still, it seems, as a world, determined to identify each other on the basis of something semi-mythical, really, and make judgments and oppress on that basis?
It does make me worried. I mean, I fear that the 21st century is going to be seeing more genocide. And what I try to do, and what I try to, in terms of talking to students and in writing, is try to get people with a keener ear, a more kind of like listening response, and a more kind of international sensitivity to this stuff. Because we keep on being surprised. The whole expulsion of the Rohingya Muslims from Myanmar, the reaction of a lot of people was, who, where, all this continuous, who are these people? Where is this place? This massive surprise. So it'd be great if we could just get a more, not necessarily a more cosmopolitan, but a more internationally educated generation.
We need more geographers, fundamentally.
It all comes back to that.
Always. Greater words, I got a geography degree as well, so I've done my bit. I'm not sure how useful it's been in my life, but maybe I should be doing more with it. Good to talk, Alastair. Thanks for coming on.
Thanks very much.
Okay, cheers. Thanks.
So an interesting look there at what racism means, and it's a very hard thing to pin down, and as I say,
except it's getting worse. That's what we do know.
And the consequences.
Unfortunately, because it's getting worse and it's such a complicated subject, we haven't resolved anything, but at least we've given something to think about. Yeah, exactly.
And indeed, yes, that kind of vagueness, I'm afraid, is going to extend, because we were just thinking, what on earth are we going to talk about next week? And frankly, at the moment,
we don't know. And look, we've got a week to sort it out, haven't we? But sometimes
much is happening.
There's much happening in the world, and we want to make sure that we're on the ball with it. And so, but that raises the question, actually. I mean, if there's something if you're listening to the podcast regularly, first of all, we'd like to get some feedback from you, because you've been remarkably quiet. We know you're there.
We assume it's embarrassed silence, but who knows?
So actually, you can. I'll give you my email, which is phil@loudmouthcoms.com. Might be one way to get in touch with us. The other one is to leave a review on Apple Podcasts or Google or wherever you're listening to this. If there's an opportunity to leave a rating
or thoughts about what you'd like us to talk about, that's another thing.
That is exactly the other point I was going to make. I mean, help us to choose the agenda for this podcast, because it's here for you.
It is indeed. So let us know what you think.
For us as well. We enjoy doing it, but it is ultimately for you.
Yes, and you don't have to be kind, please. Well, obviously do, but you don't have to be.
We'll ignore you if you're not, though.
Anyway, but we will talk about something.
We'll definitely be talking about something. We can guarantee that. Next week on The Why Curve. We'll see you then. Thanks for listening.
Bye.
The Why Curve.